Molweni, hello everybody. It's always so lovely to be back here at the Forge because I'm always amongst friends. And in Nkatile Yvonne Nomwelela, because every time I come here, I'm always in conversation with someone, so I don't know what I'm supposed to do with an empty chair. So thank you so much for today and the invitation, and thank you all for coming. Because that's where I was going to start as well. I was going to start with the poem, so thank you so much for reading it. And it's also so weird when people appreciate your poem like that. Thank you. So as Yvonne was reading it, actually, I started counting, and I've never done this before. I started counting the number of names that I list in that poem. And so you'll notice it's a list poem, and listing is going to come up a lot as I talk. And that was deliberate, because for me, Ukuzilanda is about listing. And together with listing of those names, I also list almost 5 or 6 acts of Ukuzilanda. And so there are names and then there are practices. And those two things for me always sit together when we're talking about Ukuzilanda. So the reason I don't know where to kind of start, but the reason I started using this word, and I want us to think of it as a word, as a concept, and as a practice. And when I came to this, I was actually doing my PhD at the time, and Gamnandi Dr. Shange is here, because when we first actually explored this, we were on a panel together at UNISA, and that was where she was responding to something I had been thinking about. It was the first time I think I presented on this idea of Ukuzilanda, and it was a very and it's still an idea in formation. I don't think I'm fully aware of what it means. And I'm going to come back to some of my own krengam about even the ways in which I use it or we use it. And at the time, I was busy with my PhD as well as a paper on Charlotte Maxeke. And Charlotte Maxeke and Nonzizim Kweto. And what I was struggling with was so in the PhD, one of the things I was experimenting with was using isiXhosa to think through what I'm doing, which is not a novel idea, but it was a practice of saying there are words. So for example, when I did my master's, we were using Latin words like habitus from Bourdieu. And I was like, well, what's up with Latin that we can use Bourdieu's work to kind of theorize something, but we can't use isiXhosa, which is a language that is so close to me, to theorize. And so that's where the idea came in. And I've been doing that over and over again. And I think I'm working towards one day actually writing an entire academic paper in isiXhosa, because I've written blogs in isiXhosa, I've written poetry in isiXhosa, but I'm yet to write like a 6,000 word academic ndondoni in isiXhosa to break this thing down that ilwimi zethu cannot be languages of theory and ilwimi zethu are not languages of the academy. And so that's what I was working through when I was doing the PhD. And so I used I began to use Ukuzilanda as a theory alongside other words. So in my work, I've used the idea of erasure, for example. I started using it as Ukunyamalaliswa, which is one of the poems I've written, but also Ungubona Nokungabona, which is an idea that I've been writing about in relation to Unoni Jabavu, and that was the PhD. So the work is still in continuation. So even as I'm talking today, the work for me, it's not a complete complete kind of practice. It's still a work in progress. And so that's probably where I'm kind of sitting with the discomfort, or the kind of, I'm not quite sure where I'm going with this idea, but the practice of it, I'm going to make it much clearer, hopefully by the end of this presentation. Well, not presentation, just sharing. And so while I was thinking through this idea of Ukuzilanda, so obviously it's not obviously, but it's a Nguni word. I come from it in isiXhosa, but it's not my word. It's an everyday word. And Kosi and I, Makosi and I have been having long chats about this tension of what academia does to our words, right? So now you guys can't use the word Ukuzilanda without referencing me, which thing is nonsense because Sizilanda every single day as people. So I think we also need to be careful about what we do when we bring our languages and our words and these concepts that we've been using every single day into the academy, and then the academy wants to appropriate it and situate it with one person because that's how the academy works, and now you only can ever talk about Ukuzilanda and Masola 2021, which thing is nonsense because that is a word, that's a communal word. It makes meaning in relation to a community, and maybe it's an opportunity to disrupt the ways in which we think of our words in the academy and what happens, our words and our work in the academy. And often I say to people, you know, don't bring everything to the academy because the academy doesn't deserve it. And that's a conversation for another day. And so I want us to think so I'm kind of thinking through even, right, it's not a complete idea. So there's the word in the way in which we use it in our everyday that doesn't need the academy or my academic writing to legitimize it. It's there, people use it, people do with it. Ukulanda indaba, ukulanda umlando. There's so many ways, we do it every single day, right? When we're telling stories, that's what we're doing, silanda indaba. And then you kind of leap from the kind of everyday to the concept. And when does an everyday word become a concept? And when does that concept, or maybe what is the relationship between that concept and the practice? And I think all those three things are constantly rubbing up against each other. And none of that is happening at any given time, depending on the person, depending on the time, depending on the context, depending on the work that needs to be done. But the idea, I think, also came from, and I want to read it, when I was working on the PhD, I came across this idea of listing. So Ukuzilanda, as the poem does, it's to list. Xandi's tuta, my clan names, and someone asked me, ungokabani okanye ungowapi, I will give them a list of names. But that's not just a list, it's a story. And so this idea of lists, Brittany Cooper also used it in her work in the book called Beyond Respectability, where she's looking at African-American women who were doing this in the late 19th century and early 20th century. So again, there's a conversation between what Brittany Cooper, an African-American scholar, is doing in relation to what we're doing in terms of feminist historiography or African historiography pertaining to women. And so I make that linkage of, one, we're all having the same conversation, but two, there's something about a feminist historiography that wants to bring more names, because there's something about history and the ways in which it's been practiced, particularly in the academy and not necessarily in our everyday lives. And I keep making this distinction of the academy and our everyday lives, and maybe we can talk about that in the discussion. Where particularly in perhaps the Southern African context or the African context, I don't know, and it's difficult to kind of narrow it down, where history is about silos and individual stories and about individual people, and it's about the grand narratives and how sometimes people get lost in those grand narratives. And so how does listing help us rectify some of that? How does listing help us respond to some of that? Maybe not even to rectify. And maybe it's not even a reactive. It's just saying, oh, we see this way that you're doing history. Some of us want to do history this way. In fact, some of us have been living history this way. And this is how we're engaging this idea. So Brittany Cooper, and I'm going to read the extract. She talks about this idea of listing and how these African-American women used to list their accomplishments in newspapers and pamphlets because they were so aware that they could get swallowed up in the grand narratives of people like Frederick Douglass, W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, and all of a sudden their work disappears. And so there's that kind of trajectory. The example that I often use a lot is Ellen Kuzwayo's autobiography, Call Me a Woman, which is a beautiful example of a listing, Ukuzilanda, because right at the end of her autobiography, she lists all the women who were lawyers, she lists all the women who were medical doctors. Even in the pictures, she doesn't just have family pictures, she has pictures of women who inspired her. So there's this sense of collectiveness of, there's so many of us doing this work, and it is our responsibility to keep mentioning each other's names, because we're always at the risk of being ignored, at the risk of being put to the margins, at the risk of being deliberately put aside, which is the danger of erasure and marginalization, but also erasure as a very practical thing. It's not something that happens by mistake. It's something that people actively do. And I think that's what this listing points to. It's that one of the ways to mitigate against erasure and marginalization is being in community. I think it's much harder for someone to be erased if they are situated within these lists. But you are at risk of being erased if you are an individual and therefore can be set aside because you don't fit into a particular kind of narrative. So I'm going to read, I keep saying I'm going to read, I'm actually going to read it now. And so she talks about these lists where she says, these lists were their own genealogies of black women thinkers. I do not think of these lists as mere lists. Instead, the intentional calling of names created an intellectual genealogy of race women's work and was a practice of resistance against intellectual erasure. So there's also the sense of making these lists public is also another way of mitigating against that erasure. And then she continues, these lists situate black women within a long lineage of prior women who have done similar kinds of work, and naming those women grants intellectual, political, and or cultural legitimacy to the black woman speaking their names. Listing also refers in the fashion industry to an edge produced on a fabric, on a piece of fabric and applied to a seam to prevent it from unraveling. In similar fashion, black women's long traditions of intellectual production constitute a critical age, without which the broader history of African American knowledge production would unravel and come apart at the seams. And so while Brittany Cooper's work is interested in intellectual work, I'm also interested in cultural work. I'm interested in spiritual work. I'm interested in all forms of work that black women do that can easily be appropriated to other people. And one of the things I've actually learned about erasure just in doing this work is that we sometimes also think that erasure is happening there far away and it's been done by white people or it's been done by the men. But I think at some point we're also going to talk about how that erasure is being done by people who are allies, by people who we bring into the rooms with us. And that's probably been the most challenging part about talking about erasure, because we think of it as outside of us, and by us I perhaps mean black feminists. But what happens when we ourselves appropriate each other's work and erase each other inadvertently? And that for me is a far trickier one, because I just didn't anticipate it would happen in my lifetime. You know, I thought it would happen much later in the same way I've been tracking how Noni Jabavu's erasure happens, and I can kind of say, oh no, it happens much later, it happens in the 80s, or it happens because she's traveling, or it happens because she's no longer writing as prolifically, etc. But I'm seeing a different kind of erasure, and it's requiring a different kind of set of strategies to be like, what is this kind of erasure? What is it about someone who can produce a body of work and just not name certain people, and just pretend that those people didn't do that work? Because the other challenge I think with African intellectual histories is that we're constantly, when we're kind of going back to archives, we're finding that the work has actually been done. And we're finding that the archive is there, or it's not labeled, or it's in family homes, or it's in ways in which are not very obvious to us. But more and more, I think, because Ukuzilanda is kind of requires an ethic of saying, yes, I'm finding something and there is something new that I found, but what I've also found is this body of work that other people have done. So 2 weeks ago, the Institute of Creative Arts at UCT, I co-curated with Nsadi Mofokeng, and Jay Pather was part of the planning of this. We hosted a symposium on exactly this, feminist historiographies, and we used Makhosazana Xaba's poem, Tongues of Their Mothers, to frame the event. And the reason why we did that is because Makhosazana Xaba's poem, Tongues of Their Mothers, which I'm not going to read because I read every single time I'm doing this kind of work, I'm not going to do it today, is that it is that poetic form of Ukuzilanda. She's doing the exact same thing. And so it was important for me, I think, to also kind of pay an homage to her to say, look, we recognize what this poem can do. And for me, there's a poetic practice that is linked to a political practice that is linked to an intellectual project about this idea of bringing everyone along and bringing all those stories along. And so that's the political work that I'm thinking of, is that what are this event, being together and talking about this, and maybe 2 or 3 other examples that I'm going to talk about, and perhaps some of the challenges with the practice, which is the political work. And we can think of, I don't know if it's political with a capital letter P or political with a small letter p, in terms of what this work is. And so one of it is bringing these histories into the public. I think the work that The Forge does is very much about that. There's work that Legacy Creates or Asanda Sizani have been doing with the publication of the magazine on Unoktela Dube, as well as the recent one on Unoni Jabavu. And so Asana Kutula Collective that Uyuvan mentioned, we were part of grappling with what does that work mean? What does it mean to bring history into not into the public, because history is already in the public, so I'm not making that claim at all, is to bring other histories into the public that are not on statues, that are not on buildings, that are not on street names, that are not in the big kind of visible, tangible way. So for example, I often say to people, why is there no university named after Charlotte Maxeke if she's the first black woman graduate, right? But we'll have a university named after Rhodes, we'll have a university named after Sol Plaatje, we'll have a university, who else, which other universities named after Makato, Nelson Mandela. And so we know that that is a way of commemorating people, right? So history is already in the public, but it's in the public in a very problematic way. So what we've been trying to do as Asana Kutula is creating events. It was the first time, and I think it came from this urgency of when I was writing the paper on Nokuzichaza and Charlotte Maxeke, I've been and telling people about it and talking to people about it. And at that time, Charlotte Maxeke, more than Nokuzichaza, was coming into the public. Nokuzichaza was known amongst people who were in the literary space and the African language space. And so what does it mean to bring and evoke the name of Nokuzichaza in the public? And so we started this collective called Asana Kutula Collective from Nokuzichaza's words, Asana Kutula umhlaba ubolile. We cannot keep quiet when the world is in shambles, which is like this kind of clarion call she does throughout her poetry and prose in the 1920s, together with Maibuye Africa. So that's what we were trying to do. And it's really actually challenging. It's not just come, let's bring everybody together. And when maybe I talk about the challenges, is I'm realizing just the economics behind doing this work. There's money, there's capacity, there is paying people for their time, there's not being able to pay people for their time, but honoring people's time. And so that was part of the challenge with the work of Asana Kutula. When Milusutando Bongela and I started Umoya on African Spirituality, our podcast, which we partnered with Kaya FM on, I think we were doing this work of Ukuzilanda. In fact, it was an interview in Nomsaki where she captured it in such a punchy way, and I quoted her in my PhD because I was like, this is exactly it. So I quote Umsaki, I quote Lungandila's work, because cultural workers are also interested in this work. So it's not, again, I don't want to appropriate this and make this like an intellectual idea, is that it's already there through artists like Umsaki and Ulungandila. And so Umoya for us was bringing African spirituality into the public in a very particular way. And we only did one season. But again, it was the stretching of this muscle, because for a long time, there was a sense of if twasanga okanye you can't talk about African spirituality. And we weren't claiming that at all. Because but singabantu who experience umoya. And for us, it was such a profound kind of 10 episodes of thinking through bringing African spirituality into a way, because also people only ever want to talk about it when there's a problem, right? We don't talk about just African spirituality as something that can edify us, singabantu abamnyama, talking about ukuphahla. So people can start a conversation or an event, let's have a moment of silence or let's pray, but we all get really jittery when we want to burn a candle or put some water here. I mean, the water's in bottles here, but put a bowl of water and to kind of sanctify the spaces that we're in a way that doesn't give us the heebie-jeebies. But incense, yamandia, on a stick can be burnt in a room. And so that's what we were experimenting with. And I think we were really lucky to get the response that we got. A lot of people are still listening to Umoya because it's still available online. And I think even though it was 10 episodes and it took a lot out of us, and I don't know if we'll ever do season 2, for me, it taught me so much about this idea of Ukuzilanda and bringing it into the public and bringing it to people whose lives have really been shifted or disrupted by how African spirituality is denigrated. I mean, I remember going to school, a multicultural school, and kind of doing all the things of multiculturalism, and the Hindu kids could wear those red strings, I don't know what they're called, and no one would ask a question because somehow that is acceptable. But if because you're told to cut it off. Even to this day, kids are being accosted and harassed when teachers want to cut it today, so, and it's almost as if we're not in Africa. We have to explain, not this one, this is just for beauty. But we have to explain, but when people wear bindi or wear saris, it's exotic, it's appreciated. But God forbid you wear ishweshe for a whole week, people were asking, what's the occasion? Why? What's happening? And you're just like, no, it's cold. I wear mpato in winter because practically it's just a warm skirt. And people are like, what's happening? And so there's this idea that we're also performing our Africanness all the damn time, rather than this is what we do, we live it. So I think also just our cultural aesthetic, our way of showing up in the world, and I mean, we've had so many artists, what Oma Dosini are doing, what Wilson Mhlongo was doing, what Thandiso Mazwai is doing. It's as if that body of work does not exist. And so what does it mean to take that body of work seriously? And I'm not doing it in the academic context to show white people anything. I'm just like, this is also what we've been doing for a very long time, and y'all just didn't know. I mean, I saw a quote just recently. They were talking about, there's an article that came out on News 24, and I wish, it's too far now. And the first paragraph of, they're announcing this project between Corey Library and UCT Emandulo. My colleagues are probably going to be a bit touched when they watch this, but I'm going to do it anyway. And it's this News 24 article, and it's announcing this project between Corey Library and Emandulo, which is a UCT project about digitizing the archives, particularly African language archives. And because it's News 24, the article begins, and I'm paraphrasing, for a long time, African language archives have been ignored or been inaccessible. I'm like, inaccessible to whom? Because if they're inaccessible to you, monolingual English speaker, doesn't mean they've been inaccessible to me. You ask any black child from a particular era, in a particular place, liza lisitinga lakho, sinelizwi likaThixo oloThixo omkhulu, and they'll tell you immediately what that story is. If you say umagogo to certain people, they'll know exactly what it means. So there's certain things that people say that have been inaccessible. I'm like, no, please qualify that. Accessible to whom or inaccessible to whom? It's just that beningaziboni ezizinto nina that we're now making acceptable to you because you finally got embarrassed about the fact that you just ignored a whole entire archive that's written in African languages, which a lot of people like Nomalanga Mkhize has been talking about, that they just these entire historical debates that have been happening where people's work was just erased. And so people are catching up to that, white people are catching up to that, and it's like, oh, and maybe we just didn't feel the need to bring this to you, and now you found it and you're digitizing it, cool, and then we're going to have other conversations about, okay, what are the implications of doing this work? Is it even really still accessible? And of course, I'm talking, there's still a whole lot of gaps in terms of the political work of accessibility, right? So if something is digitized, is it accessible? And I know people are having those conversations, and I'm not going to belabor that, but I was just so struck by, and maybe I'll find it during the Q&A, I was just like, the nerve, to say that things have been inaccessible or not, like, to whom? You just didn't bring them in. I went my whole entire school career knowing Unongawuse through the stories my mother was telling, not because it was in the history books that the school was sharing with me, and only much later finding the works of other people. So, yeah, and I think that's the promise of the political work that we need to do is not, I'm becoming very angsty or skeptical about how we bring black work or black history, and I'm just gonna use that as a shorthand, into certain spaces that for a long time just ignored us. And are we doing it to show? It's that distraction, Toni Morrison. Are we showing them something, or are we just doing it for ourselves because we've been doing this for ourselves? And I've been using this word edify a lot. I write about Noni Jabavu to edify myself. Oli and I wrote Imbokodo, which is out in the window. Oh my gosh. To edify ourselves. We're not writing for particular people, to explain to particular people. And I think until we stop doing that as black people, I often think, like, who is the audience for some of the work that we do in terms of the cultural production that assumes an audience, but also, who are we doing this work for, maybe? And then maybe one or two challenges is this question of capacity. Political work is collective work. And so capacity is at the cornerstone of all this work. So part of the reasons why Millie and I didn't do season 2 of Umoya was just our own capacity. And I think it's been one of the things that's been sitting with me one way or the other. Like, could we have done it another way where season 2 could be done by other people? But because it was a project that kind of ideated between the two of us and we brought our community in, there hasn't been enough time to think about how do we collectivize our work? How do we really, really live the ethic of community? Because and I think that's the danger of this, the academy, right? Is that the academy wants to reference this particular person. It's still quite individualistic. But if I say, actually, and there's, I'm not going to explain this very well, but even if you think of the referencing style of academia, so how do you reference a kitchen table conversation? How do you reference gossip? Because sometimes that's where I find my information. And someone wanted to, a colleague of mine that I met, kind of highways and byways, said she wanted to do, her name's Keyung? Why have I forgotten Keyung's surname? She's at SOAS, and she's been inviting me to do this work for about 3 years. And she wants to kind of write this compendium of alternative ways of referencing gossip, referencing your grandmother's conversation, referencing hymns, referencing our dreams, referencing all these other things that the academy actually doesn't know what to do with. But we want to bring them in, again, not to show anything or to prove anything, but to say, we're actually coming with this whole wealth of knowledge that is so much bigger than your compendium of Harvard referencing style, And I mean, I know Harvard is like, oh, we know how to reference a magazine, we know how to, but it's also textual. And so it's a question of what is a text? What do we mean when we are talking about a text? And so those are the kind of challenges I'm thinking through in this work. I'm really struggling through the question of, and I'm going to stop now. I'm really struggling through the question of community. And what that means in intellectual work, in cultural work. I mean, cultural work, that one's almost kind of figured itself out. Cultural workers are constantly collaborating. And even in the intellectual work, I have found myself in really affirming feminist collaborations, but at times they often still feel so precarious because they are working within this context of the neoliberal academy that really kind of forces us to pit against each other. It's almost like we're squabbling for ideas sometimes. And I'm like, no, there's space for all of us. There's space for all of us to have a conversation. So, yeah, maybe at the end I'll read the poem that I wanted to read, but I'm going to pause now, but I wanted to read the poem Ukunyamalaliswa and this idea of how erasure happens, but I'll pause there for now.
It's funny how before I came here I had questions that I had prepared because Kaka is Febe, my favorite poems of all times. But now because of what you just said, I'm so frustrated to articulate what I want to say. Firstly, I think let me start with I think on the question or on the idea of referencing. I think you once mentioned something about the footnote being a place of erasure. I would like you to please elaborate on that. That's the first part. Second question would be on, so my understanding of, especially from today, because I think growing up I've always understood Ukuzilanda as when it looks like we need to go and do a ritual so that right? And then from today or from tonight, I think I'm getting that the idea of listing as a practice of Ukuzilanda. Because I remember when I was reading Collective Amnesia, there's a poem that Koleka writes where they're just mentioning amagama of these people, right? And then I think the poem that Usisi Yvonne opened with, Ukuzilanda, you also mentioned people. And I'm just sitting here wondering, how do you get to select these names? I think it was, as a black person, Kutwa Sikula as a community. You have Abu Malume Bako, Abu Tata Bako, Abu Mkulu Bako, but in this particular poem of Ukuzilanda, you mentioned there's specific women, and I think that's the same thing that Koleka does. And I wonder why, what's this urgency of specifically selecting these black women? Because I think there's also like black men that have influenced your life. There's there's white classics that you've read by white women, but what's this urgency of you choosing to only mention these black women?
Okay. Hi, my leader. How's your heart? Surviving. So I just wanted to allude to No Gender's point, and further maybe ask you, how would you best explain what does it mean to be seen and not to be seen, and how do we further negotiate of self and community, taking into cognizance the passive aggressiveness of questioning one's intersectionality? And then I also wanted to understand, because I've been following your work, and then I actually love how your work is centered around erasure and suffocation and disruption and dismantling of heteronormative spaces, specifically from the positionality of black women and how they've been erased from history and her story and their story. So I wanted to further also just ask, why is South Africa so comfortable with erasing the experiences of black and brown women and folks, despite the fact that she or they are a pioneer, take into consideration time politics? And further, how do we resurrect one's memory without erasing self and others, with taking into cognizance queer people, trans people, poor people, sex workers, and differently abled folks? I give thanks.
Hello. I don't know if I want to pose a question or rather give a comment, right? I think I'm very pleased by the work, or the kind of work that you're particularly doing. And I'm looking at your work from, as a dreamscape in particular, if I can put it that way, within a setting that is very constricting of agency to be, and particularly speaking of women experiences and narrativizations and narratives, right? And I'm looking at the kind of work that you're particularly doing around the issues of methodologies, epistemologies as well, right? the ability to infuse Xhosa, and comfortably so. And I think I want to laud you for that. That's the first thing. I really want to laud you. And not to say that we should be praising each other for it, right? But just the strength and the ability to adopt and reimagine certain kinds of methodologies, epistemologies that would possibly bring about emancipation to a number of women who are still to actually be tracing the kind of work that you're particularly doing. I think the second thing I want to really speak to is the idea of history itself, and that is particularly a topic that I'm doing, memory, violence, and histories for my PhD currently. And how I'm so proud of how you mentioned the fact that Black women's experiences are forever intact in every place or setting in particular. And by that I mean there's never a time in which there is bringing to life the Black woman's experiences. But it's basically a thing of, it's there, and it's whether it's ignored, whether it's not visible and recognized and given respect, it is there. Whether it's devalued, it is there, right? And contrasting that to the notions of memory itself, how memory, and particularly from a Eurocentric, westernized perspective, how the idea of memory, how the idea of history, how the idea of geographic specialities are constantly delimited to time and space, right? And I get to see that the experiences of Black people, the reason why they're actually not recognized within the frameworks of valid methods, valid epistemes, is because of the very same notion of how they are not actually delimited to that, of how they are constantly visible, of how they're constantly embraced, even if the people who are actually embracing those experiences are constantly repressed and oppressed by their regimes and systems. The other thing I want to speak about is the idea of the academy. You spoke so profoundly about the whole notion of referencing and the listing, right? The idea of how to list those people and the importance in the listing. And I was thinking around the whole idea of, to what degree are we able to reference these people? And by this I mean, for example, you can have Black women who are quite transgressive, who are quite resistant to systems, like what you're doing. We are referencing a couple of women who have actually come before you, or who are doing the same work as you're doing, for purposes of actually archiving the work, right? And archiving these narratives that are constantly erased within the setting. To what degree do we say it's okay to actually reference within academic space? And to what degree are we to actually limit people from actually referencing and appropriating these very notions of conceptions that are constantly created or spoken about in particular? I don't know if I'm making sense to you. So, yeah.
Zofunda apha mas nangona ndihleli kwi-main table between andizoziphendula zonke, because I think we're also here to think aloud and just listen and learn from each other. So I'm not gonna, and I mean anybody else in the audience hopefully can afikelela apho ndingafikelelanga khona, in a sense. And I want to start with the comments that right at the end, Lwando was making. And as you were speaking, I was thinking of this idea of memory. I mean, I didn't even touch on that. Again, memory studies, big area of historiography and literary studies or cultural studies. But as you were speaking, and I guess maybe I've tried to make this point, is there's also, do we have to give everything to the public? Do we have to give everything to the academy? Right? In this moment of, especially, and I'm going to use it in the context that I find it the most pressing in this context of black girl magic, in this context of black excellence, somehow black people must always be accessible. We must know everything. We must take everything from them, and we must give everything, right? But there must be things that we can withhold for ourselves. And a friend of mine, Ukuzilanda, always talks about this idea of opacity. Where do we leave the space for just some mystery as black people, for our own sense of dignity, that we don't have to give everything just because that's the only way that people can find us accessible is when we are still doing and performing. There's a beautiful book written by Kevin Kwashi. I don't know if that's how you pronounce his surname, Quashie, about the sovereignty of the quiet. What happens when black people are quiet? And we don't perform for anyone because that's what we want to do. Or when we can't find things about black women from history because they made it deliberately so, maybe. Maybe they didn't want to know. Maybe Louise Mvemve wrote in the newspapers and she wanted people to know about her work. But maybe there are other healers that are just like, no, and fununika amayeza am. But now indigenous knowledge systems, and fununika ipattern yam yensimbi. And unika, and that's it. You know, if Nes Funindozam come to my house, build relationship with me, build community with me. That's a prerequisite if you want anything from me. But this idea that we must constantly be available. So I kind of shadow with that of like, yes, I'm in this work of let's make it known. Here are the stories. But I'm also just like, what does it mean for black women to rest in peace? Just kesbayeke abantu bamnyama and sizigcine into zethu because into zethu. And just because the academy or mainstream knowledge production doesn't have it, doesn't mean it's not there. I think I'm getting quite anxious about this constant performance that we must do, even in this work. And it's so outward focused rather than inward focused. So that's what came to mind, and I'm okay with that. But I'm really sitting with this tension of if abayaz, nandiyayaz. And maybe it matters, but nandiyayaz, nabantu bam siyayazi, and we keep it moving. Which is why I think I wrote, I'm so glad that I wrote poems in isiXhosa first. And to see, are you going to translate them? I'm not going to translate them. My friends have offered to translate them, but there's this need to constantly want into zethu, and that we must constantly give into zethu. And I'm like, no, shame. And maybe I'm being like some Xhosa Nostra or whatever, but like I'm just like I think, and it really became apparent when this book came out. I was like, why is the question translation? Why isn't I must learn this language so that I can also be part of this conversation? So I'm thinking a lot about that. This question of unseen and seen. I spoke about it when you were at the launch. But Gogo, you were speaking because you do have the book Foundational Writers here, right? I saw it at another bookshop, but and so in the chapter that I wrote in Foundational Writers, as edited by Begi, Kwezi, and Makosaza Naqaba, is this idea of ukubona nokungabonwa. But people can be very deliberate. You know, and that's part of the thing of what happens when we know people are deliberate about not seeing us. And so that's my reluctance to perform. And I think that's why I don't do disclaimers about using isiXhosa. My supervisor made it very easy for me. And I was like, I have this thing that I want to explain, but it's only coming up in isiXhosa. And she was like, and we'll figure it out. So I don't do any footnotes or any acrobats to explain why I'm debating isiXhosa, because I've been trans-languaging. I've been multilingual, and I've been in multilingual contexts. And so andizutalaza to do this, because that's all I've been doing. Ngelishwa, because mainstream knowledge production has been very monolingual. That's a problem that they now are confronted with because we're coming into the space. So, and I guess it is, it's a gaslighting in a sense. It's the violence, it's the epistemic violence. And why are we so comfortable with it? Because we're comfortable with violence. Asphilanga, guys. Asphilanga. I-violence is pete. in all its forms. And I think that's why I just want to do work that's edifying. If for myself mostly, and Kosi always says this, you write for yourself and other people benefiting from that is the bonus. And when she said that to me, it's like something just untangled inside of me. And so I think all the work I do is to heal myself, and I know that in healing myself, I heal. And for me, it's not so much, I'm reluctant often to use this word as healing, but it's coming up now. But I do that for myself, my community, because I know what it means for my mother to see her mother on the cover of my book. I know what it means for Upele to see herself, she passed away, on the cover of my book. And I'm doing that for them. I'm okay with doing it for my people, and then other people benefit, and it's that thing of we give permission for other people. So I'm not downplaying the violence. I'm saying life must be lived. Hey, we must live, because climate and things are bad. But as things are bad, and I think things have always been bad. I mean, many of us, I was born in a state of emergency, and when I made that connection, I was like, oh gosh, it's never been a good idea to just be joyful as a black person. Like, if we just look 300 years, 400 years, there's just always been strife. So, lendwana sibonayo about epistemic violence and physical violence and all forms of violence, we living in the thick of it. But I think I'm making the choice for it not to overdetermine me. Otherwise, I'm not going to live. Actually, all I'll do is be somebody's idea of me, and I'll wake up one day and I'm 60 and I'm like, oh my gosh, what did I do that gives me joy? So as a small practice that I started doing for myself, and I got it from this poet, I think Brown. He has an essay, he's got a book of essays called The Book of Delights. And all I've been doing this year, and I found him on a podcast on Being, and I listened to this podcast, and he wrote about delightful things. And since I listened to that podcast, it was very early in the year, it's kind of been directing everything that I do. And I started journaling just delights. So before, I used to just journal gratitude. I have a gratitude jar, and I'd write these little gratitude things, and then I'd revisit it at the end of the year. And when I started writing about delights, and almost looking for them and paying attention for delights beget delight. The more delights and the more joyous things you see, the more they happen. So small things. Kindness at the airport. I love airports. People are so kind at the airport. We're so considerate of each other. Yesterday, I was walking on campus, Ndatimla, and someone said, and I'm a loud sneezer, and someone said, and because it's pollen and whatnot, and someone said, bless you. She was far away, and I didn't even think they noticed that I was sneezing. A delightful thing of paying attention to ourselves and paying attention to small things. I mean, I could give you long lists. When I take a walk, there's a father and daughter pair, and when it's 7:15 in the morning, and the father's got the daughter, and I thought, oh, how nice it must be for this little girl to be walking to school with her dad, and she's on his shoulders, and they look like they're having this fat chat. There's a little boy I used to see on my walk who was on a unicycle. He's 5, 6 years old, testing out his unicycle. Just small human things, just just paying attention, because once we're overly determined by the politics, and I'm not saying that those things are not important, but I'm just so interested in how do we pay attention to the small things that make us human. And it's about seeing and unseen, because that's about paying attention to yourself, to people. I could go on and on about delights. It's like a whole practice for myself now. How do you select the names? Because it's the most difficult ones. Yeah, and so this practice of listing, the praise to our mothers, does the exact same thing. Betty Govinder's poem does the exact same thing. Tongues of Their Mothers is a listing poem. So there is this genre of listing. And I guess for me, the cynical part is to say, oh, but why didn't you include so-and-so, which we've been getting a lot with Imbokodo. Why didn't you include this? Why didn't you? As though we've forgotten those people, or as though they're not valuable. But I think on the positive side, if we looked at it, it's an invitation to say, let's all do more. So if we did 30 kwimbokodo, that means uyivon uneyakhe 30. That means wena no gender uneyakho 30. That means sonke masizeni ezethu list. And mhlambi sizoxuba, or there'll be overlaps. But for me, when I saw Kosi's poem, my instinct wasn't, oh my gosh, why didn't she include so-and-so? Which is a normal and human reaction. But it's like, oh my gosh, what if there are more? And then my responsibility is to then pay attention. So, Wimbokodo, we include someone like Paulina Dlamini and Louisa Mvemve. And not because that work wasn't done. I mean, Paulina Dlamini wrote an entire book about her life because she knew her life was going to be important one day. But it was only in one book and kind of reproduced in reviews and smolanyana ways. But it was also just like, oh my gosh, there are all these women that have done smolanyana work, and like, how do we then amplify it? So you've also got to make those choices. And I think the choices for me are okay. They're about agency. They're about, they're not about like cultish, you know? You can look at it that way and be like, oh, 31, and yeah, and I've really struggled with that question a lot. At points where I've said to Xoli, if that question comes up, Xoli, please, you respond to, because I take such offense when people are like, why did you only write black women? And my response is always, well, they got to buy the book, so let me not be mean. But I'm like, wow, you noticed that there were only black women. Because people are always asking it from like an entitlement that they should be there. And I'm like, literally at one book launch, it was a white woman who asked this question, and I was like, well, we're not going to write about white women. I'm just not going to do that. Someone else can do that. In fact, here are all these books, and I listed all these books that have already got white women. And I was like, what is it about when we do see a book edifying 30 black women that we already see problems with it? Why couldn't we just say, well done, thank you. Maybe next time write about so-and-so. But I do think there's something about us not wanting to see black women recognized in that particular way. And so we must find a problem with it. And so that's a critique, and I take it, and I'm like, yeah, cool, moving on. And I see the discomfort. Monday, I was speaking at a school, majority white, and I could see kringam, everyone, because I'm giving them names of people they don't know, so they don't know how to locate. And I'm like, why do you not know how to locate yourself? Yeah, you like kringam, and I love watching it. And I'm like, oh, shame, eh? And he says, oh, look, because there are just so many. I'm here for you to learn new names. I'm here for you to pronounce different words, hear the sound of them in your mouth for the first time, you know? So yeah, it's a challenge, and I listing names, it's choices, and we all must make those choices, and yeah.
For me, I think it's more of, I don't know whether it's a comment, and basically you mentioned something like, you know, with Hindus, they wear whatever that they wear, but if ever you are Zulu, Xhosa, you wear that thing, it's becoming a problem. I've noticed it on a workplace. Let's say you need to go and we all twice and something like that. If your boss is black, he can allow you or she can allow you, but if he's white, it's a problem. So my question is that what is that needs to be done, like to conscientize our society and communities about our African cultural beliefs?
So I'll give you 2 minutes to respond.
Okay.
Maybe I'll take another.
I'll try to be very quick with
I'll
that
take
one.
another question, very short, 1 minute maybe. Yeah.
It's not so much that what is to be done, it's already there. Our constitution allows us, we must just live, nje. My memo to black people, and black women in particular, phila ubomi bakho. Everybody else is going to catch up. Because, I mean, you show anybody the constitution, what's the problem? You know, so people must just keep it moving, and Human Rights Commission is there for that, but we also mustn't fight. I'm just done having that fight. Yes, Pandla, Nensimbi, Nenwele. I mean, really. In Africa, Aibo.
Gqirha. Ukuphelisa yonke le ngxaki le. No, as for us always to be conformists, we should start radicalizing, you know, these centers of knowledge information. Effort has started already. So sawuhlala siphi simane sichaza uba amathamba atshiselwa ntoni, zinduna esizifake apho. Kodwa sibabuza ithini. Then now, once we have our own people heading all of those departments, curriculum delivered in our languages, then we solve the problem. Effort has started already. Then can the other institutions follow the suit? So, because now, remember what happened in Konongaus? They infiltrated all the systems of knowledge of life of Africans. We are where we are now. Neoliberalism started there.
Look, I work in the academy, but I don't give all of myself to the academy. And so I'm not interested whether the academy will radicalize or not. I think we must radicalize other spaces. I think we must radicalize our homes. Academy, so we'll come back to it maybe even. But for me, let's radicalize our homes, our communities. Lendo yo ubuntu, let's radicalize ubuntu. And I'm not that person like ubuntu better bupelile. I mean, and maybe I come from that perspective of like seek first the kingdom, and for me it's like seek first the most important thing, and all these other things shall be added unto you. And so I don't know. I'm very the academy. I'm in it. I work there. I produce things for it. I think I know what to do when I'm there, but I keep it at arm's length because I can do other things with it because it's not the only thing. It cannot be the only thing that we must now put all our energy into as Black people. We've got so many other things to do, but I refuse to be again beholden to it. Or emboldened, or not emboldened, beholden to it and overly determined by it. That's just my position. Let's radicalize healthcare. Siafa. Like physically, Black people are dying because we've just got a healthcare system that doesn't care about us. Let's radicalize our homes, let's radicalize our schools. Like for me, basic education, again, is another one. Seek first the little children. And all these other ones, by the time they get to us, they by UCT. If we've done that right by them, Kwasab A or grade 1, and so I'm in two minds about it, and that's why I think there's so much work to do. I don't think we need to put all our energies into the academy, personally. Maybe I'll lose my job, and then I'll think otherwise. Ukunyamalaliswa. Amagama ethu aphaphatheka nomoya. Amazwi ethu akhaphukhaphu njengeli phepha ndibhala kulo. Aphela engumgubo. Ubuqu bethu bukhiwa ngeteaspoon. Iingcinga zethu zisesithendeni kwezemfundo. Iimbuso zethu zifaka ezincwadini kodwa kungabikho gamba. For most of history, Anonymous was a woman. Abanye bade bazingombe isifuba ngegagu besithi zange babhale nto iphucukileyo abantu ababhinqileyo. Xa ndibaphikisa ndivumbulula amagama angenambuso. Ndiyabazi babephila kodwa andinawo umfanekiso ngqondweni. Baluthotho elikhwanqisayo. Ndiyabeva bekhwaza besithi ningavumi silityalwe, ningarhoxi ningatyhafi. Ekhe nabanika ithuba lokuba bathi sasingekho, niyazi ukuba nani amagama enu aza kutshona. Kuthiwe anaziwa, anikho, aniyonto. Nani ninyamalale.